This program demonstrates the procedures for the removal and installation of line replaceable units related to the VSV/VBV systems. These include the VSV actuator, the fuel gear motor and stop mechanism, the VBV position sensor, and the master bleed valve. Variable stator vanes actuator. Removal and installation. The variable stator vanes, or VSV actuation system, is powered by two actuators mounted on the engine core at the 2 o'clock and 8 o'clock positions aft looking forward. For this demonstration, only the 2 o'clock actuator will be removed. Removal. The piston rod of the actuator has to be set to a position that allows the easiest removal. To move the piston rod, disconnect the head end and the rod end flex hoses from the hydromechanical unit. Connect the cart stator actuator adapters to the hoses. Connect the hoses from the cart to the adapters. Move the piston rod as necessary to set it in the appropriate position. Reconnect the hoses to the HMU. Now, disconnect the engine electrical harness from the actuator connector. Disconnect and remove the shroud drain tubes. Disconnect the actuator drain tube. Loosen the shroud coupling rings and slide the shroud sleeves back. Disconnect the fuel tube coupling nuts from the actuator nipples. Remove the bolt and nut from the clevis link and the bell crank assembly. Remove the bolt, nut, washer, and bushing from the actuator clevis and the clevis link. Manually push the piston rod. Remove the washer and bushing from the clevis link and the bell crank assembly. Remove the clevis link. Remove the bolt and nut attaching the rod end of the actuator to the bell crank assembly. Remove the bolt and nut attaching the head end of the actuator to the bell crank assembly. Loosen the bolts securing the bracket holding the engine electrical harness. Carefully disengage the actuator from the bell crank assembly and remove it. Remove the sleeve from the head end actuator boss. Remove and discard the O-rings from the drain shrouds and from the fuel tubes. Installation. Install new lubricated O-rings on the fuel tubes and on the drain shroud sleeves. Install the sleeve into the head end actuator boss. Carefully position the new actuator between the bell crank assembly and the fuel drain tubes. Attach it at the head end with the bolt and nut. Put the head of the bolt forward. Install the rod end actuator bolt and nut. Put the head of the bolt out. Install the clevis link in the bell crank assembly with the bushing. Manually move the piston rod and secure the clevis link with the washer, bolt, and nut. Put the bolt head out. Tighten and torque the nut. Connect the clevis link to the actuator clevis with the bushing, washer, bolt, and nut. Tighten and torque the nut. Connect the fuel tubes to the nipples of the actuator. Tighten and torque the coupling nuts. Position the drain shroud sleeves and tighten their coupling rings. Reconnect the actuator drain tube, tighten and torque the coupling nut. Reinstall the two shroud drain tubes. Tighten and torque the coupling nuts. Retighten and torque the bolts securing the electrical harness bracket. Connect the engine electrical harness to the actuator connector. This completes the removal and installation procedure of the VSV actuator. VBV fuel gear motor and stop mechanism assembly. Removal and installation. The VBV fuel gear motor is attached to the VBV stop mechanism mounted on the aft wall of the fan frame mid-box structure at the 9 o'clock position aft looking forward. The stop mechanism and the fuel gear motor are removed as an assembly, then separated from each other. Removal. Before starting, make sure the VBV doors are in the closed position. Remove a fan duct panel between struts 4 and 5 or 6 and 7. Using the VBV manual control ratchet wrench, move the doors to the closed position. Remove the VBV position sensor. Disconnect the fuel drain tubes from the fuel gear motor closed port and open port drain shrouds. Loosen and disconnect the outer coupling nuts of the shroud sleeves. Slide the sleeves fully downward to access the internal connecting nuts. Loosen the connecting nuts and disconnect the open and closed fuel supply lines. Remove and discard the O-rings. Detach the electrical harness bracket from the fuel gear motor. Loosen and remove the bolts securing the assembly to the fan frame. Remove the assembly together with the main flexible shaft. On a workbench, pull the main flexible shaft out of the assembly. Separate the stop mechanism from the fuel gear motor by removing the bolts and washers that attach them. Remove and discard the O-ring from the mounting diameter of the fuel gear motor. Installation. Prepare the stop mechanism by setting it to the closed position. Using the main flexible shaft, turn the stop mechanism torque shaft in the direction indicated by the arrow engraved on the casting. In a moment, the follower nut will come against the mechanical stop related to the closed position. Lubricate a new O-ring and fit it in the groove of the fuel gear motor. Engage the fuel gear motor in the stop mechanism and attach them using the bolts and washers. Tighten and torque the bolts. Introduce the main flexible shaft splines into the assembly and check that the follower nut is contacting the mechanical stop. Install new lubricated O-rings on the fuel supply tubes and their sliding sleeves. Since the removal procedure, the VBV doors are assumed to be in the closed position. Position the stop mechanism and fuel gear motor assembly onto the fan frame. Engage the hexagonal end of the main flexible shaft in the corresponding drive of the master bleed valve. Secure the assembly to the fan frame with the bolts. Tighten and torque the bolts. Connect the two fuel supply tubes to the fuel gear motor. Tighten and torque the coupling nuts. Slide the shroud sleeves upward and tighten their coupling nuts. Connect the drain tubes to the sleeve nipples. Tighten and torque the coupling nuts. Reinstall the VBV position sensor. Reconnect the electrical harness bracket to the fuel gear motor. A functional check of the VBV system is now necessary. Start by a manual operation of the system using the VBV manual control ratchet wrench in a free end of the VBV set. The system should rotate freely in both directions. A hydraulic operation of the system is also necessary. Disconnect the VBV open and closed hoses from the HMU. Connect the adapters of the cart stator actuator to the VBV hoses. Connect the cart stator actuator hoses to the adapters. Operate the VBV system to the open and closed position. The system must operate smoothly and freely under a pressure specified in the maintenance manual. Make sure all the doors move at the same time. Disconnect the cart stator actuator adapters from the VBV hoses. Connect the hoses to the HMU nipples. Tighten and torque them. Reinstall the fan duct panels. This concludes the procedures for the removal and installation of the VBV fuel gear motor and stop mechanism assembly. Variable bleed valve position sensor, removal and installation. The VBV position sensor is mounted on the VBV stop mechanism attached to the fan frame at the 9 o'clock position aft looking forward. Removal. Set the variable bleed valves to the closed position. Disconnect the engine electrical harness from the two sensor connectors. Remove the nut and pin that attach the feedback rod clevis to the sensor arm. Loosen and remove the 3 bolts that attach the sensor to the stop mechanism. Remove the sensor. Installation. Position the sensor on the stop mechanism and secure it with the 3 bolts. Tighten and torque the bolts. Install the pin to attach the feedback rod clevis to the sensor arm. Make sure the reference marks on the sensor body and on the sensor arm are correctly aligned. If not, remove the pin, loosen the lock nut, and turn the clevis by half turns to achieve the correct alignment of the 2 marks. Finally, check the correct engagement of the threads of the feedback rod in the clevis. A lock wire must not go through the witness hole. Install the nut on the pin and torque it. Connect the engine electrical harness to the VBV position sensor connectors. This completes the removal and installation procedures for the variable bleed valve position sensor. Master bleed valve. Removal and installation. The master bleed valve is mounted within the mid-box structure of the fan frame, between struts number 10 and 11, just above the 9 o'clock position, aft looking forward. Removal. Before starting, make sure the VBV doors are in the closed position. Now, remove the fan duct panel corresponding to the master bleed valve, and then the 2 adjacent panels. Remove the 2 flexible shafts driven by the master bleed valve by pushing each of them clockwise to compress their springs and to disengage the opposite end. Be careful not to rotate the shafts during this operation. If necessary, loosen the fan frame flexible shaft guides. Then disconnect the feedback rod from the master bleed valve lever. Remove and discard the cotter pin. Loosen and remove the nut, the washer, and the bolt. In the same manner, disconnect the feedback rod from the position sensor lever arm. Loosen the 2 screws and the 4 captive bolts that attach the master bleed valve to the fan frame. Using a 5/64 hex head wrench, disengage the end of the main flexible shaft from the bleed valve by pushing it into the VBV stop mechanism and fuel gear motor assembly. Remove the master bleed valve. Installation. Make sure that the translating nut of the new bleed valve can move without binding. Set the bleed valve near to the closed position. Make sure the VBV stop mechanism is in the closed position by turning the main flexible shaft in the direction shown by the arrow on the stop mechanism casting. Position the bleed valve into the fan frame. Don't allow the main flexible shaft to re-engage the hexagonal drive of the bleed valve. Tighten by hand the screws attaching the bleed valve to the 9 o'clock fan frame strut. Tighten by hand the horizontal bolts, then the vertical ones. With the ratchet wrench, move the VBV door as necessary to make sure it is correctly adjusted in its fan frame seat. Then torque the bolts and screws. Finally, set the VBV door to the closed position as follows. Using the ratchet wrench, close the door until it contacts the scoop. Then open it 1/8 of a turn. Engage the main flexible shaft in its housing. Reinstall the 2 lateral flexible shafts. If necessary, retighten the flexible shaft guides. Position the VBV feedback rod on the master bleed valve lever arm and attach it with the bolt, washer, and slotted nut. Tighten and torque the nut. Install a new cotter pin. Attach the feedback rod to the position sensor lever arm with the bolt, washer, and nut. Make sure the VBV position sensor lever arm is correctly aligned with the sensor mark. Now, operate the system manually in both directions to make sure it is moving freely. Reinstall the fan duct panels. This concludes the demonstration of the removal and installation procedures for the master bleed valve.